Sometimes the people we least expect are the ones who end up saving us. She was a mother on the edge of losing everything. The promises made to her had long turned to dust, abandoned by the very man who once swore forever. Her little girl, silent, delicate, wheelchair-bound, carried more strength in her stillness than most people could ever muster in a shout. And the man who stepped in to help them? He didn't know it yet, but by opening his front door, he was unlocking a part of his heart that had been sealed shut for years. This isn't just a story of kindness, it's about quiet miracles. The kind that unfold beneath the wide arms of an old apple tree and change everything. If stories like this touch your soul, consider subscribing. Here we share true-to-life moments that remind us of what really matters: love, hope, and second chances. Now, let's begin. The sun hung high over Helvin Ridge, Missouri, casting a warm glow on the little open-air market that hadn't changed in decades, and proudly so. The scent of ripe tomatoes mingled with the sweetness of sun-kissed peaches and a faint trace of old tractor oil. Elderly vendors in faded straw hats shooed flies lazily, swapping stories and gossip beneath striped awnings. It was the kind of town where folks knew each other's dogs by name, but rarely noticed the pain behind each other's eyes. But all that was about to change. Gideon Blake, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and hair touched by grey, stood quietly at his usual stall. His hands, marked by decades of farm labour, sorted apples into wooden crates that still smelled of summer and sawdust. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. People liked his quiet nods, his fair prices, and the weight of trust in his silence. But today, he wasn't watching his fruit. Across the gravel path, a scene was unfolding. A man in a crisp, spotless shirt, far too polished for a place like this, was shouting. "I told you to stop following me. You and your broken little girl, go beg someone else." The words sliced through the air. Mara Lindley stood frozen, her body trembling as she instinctively shielded her daughter. Her damp curls clung to her forehead, and though fear clouded her eyes, there was still defiance in her stare. Beside her sat little Hazel, maybe 7 or 8, hunched in a battered wheelchair that squeaked with every tiny movement. Her pale fingers clung tightly to her mother's hand, like roots grasping the earth in a storm. The crowd had stopped. They were watching, whispering, but no one moved, until Gideon did. He walked forward, slow and steady, boots crunching against gravel like thunder rolling in the distance. He knelt beside Hazel, his large, rough frame folding gently. From his back pocket he pulled a worn cloth, one he usually used to polish apples, and dabbed at the tear on Hazel's cheek. She flinched at first, but when she looked into his face, she saw no judgment, just kindness, and something even deeper, steadiness. Gideon stood and turned to face the man. "This is none of your business," the man barked. Gideon's voice was calm but strong. "You made it everyone's business the moment you humiliated a child in front of this town, a little girl who hasn't done a thing but sit here, quietly." "She's not my responsibility," the man snapped. "Neither is her mother. I've done enough." "No," Gideon replied, voice low but heavy. "You've done plenty. Damage, mostly." Then he paused, letting the silence sink in. "My daughter couldn't walk either," he said finally, "but her spirit carried her farther than most people ever dream of going. She taught me to show up, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt." The man scoffed, looking around uneasily. The crowd wasn't with him. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. "Then walk away," Gideon said simply. "But know this, everyone here saw exactly who you are." The man stormed off, his footsteps kicking up dust. Nobody followed, nobody spoke for him. Then something beautiful happened. One by one, people stepped forward. A grocer handed Mara a paper bag full of fresh fruit. A young woman offered her jacket to place over Hazel's lap. An old veteran rested a weathered hand on Gideon's shoulder, nodding in deep respect. Mara looked stunned. Her lips trembled, trying to form the words, but none came. "You okay, sweetheart?" Gideon asked Hazel gently. She nodded faintly. "Got a place to go?" he asked Mara. She shook her head. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "No, not really. Just us." He looked at the pair, this exhausted mother worn thin by life and the little girl who carried so much more than she should have. "I've got a place," he said. "It's not much. A small farmhouse, quiet, one empty room, and an old apple tree out back, kind of magical." Hazel's eyes lit up. "Magical?" Gideon smiled just a little. Well, maybe not magical, but strong, like some things ought to be. Mara hesitated. In her world, strangers didn't offer kindness like this, not without strings. But there was something about Gideon, his stillness, his sincerity. He hadn't asked her to explain, to justify, or to beg, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Gideon gently lifted Hazel and placed her in the front seat of his truck. Mara climbed in beside her. As the engine roared to life, the market behind them slowly stirred back to motion. But something had shifted in that town. People would speak of that day, not because of a loud argument, not because fists were thrown, but because someone stood up without standing over. And when kindness finally moved, it moved like thunder. The road to Gideon Blake's farmhouse wound gently through golden fields. The truck creaked and rattled, bearing not just passengers, but the fragile weight of possibility. Mara sat stiffly, fingers clenched in her lap. Hazel clutched her sketchbook like armor. Gideon didn't speak. He simply drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting against the window. He understood something many never did. Silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's space, and space is where healing begins. The farmhouse appeared, a single-story home with wood siding, peeling paint and a sagging porch. But it stood, and behind it, just beyond a weathered red shed, stood the apple tree. Wide, twisting limbs reached skyward, sheltering a lone wooden chair angled just so, as if waiting for someone. "We'll make do," Gideon said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Mara carefully lifted Hazel from the truck. Gideon pulled the wheelchair down and helped set it up. "House is old," he said, unlocking the door with a heavy key. "Floors creak, kitchen's on the right, guest room's near the stove, gets the best sun." "You really don't have to," Mara began. "I do," Gideon interrupted gently. "Not because I have to, because I want to." Inside, the home smelled of cedar and applewood. A photo sat on the mantel, of a young girl, maybe 10, holding a harmonica, eyes full of mischief and light. Mara didn't ask, she didn't need to. Hazel wheeled herself to the back room, her face lit up at the sight of the tree outside. "Can we sit out there?" she asked softly. Gideon nodded. Soon the three of them were beneath the tree, the sun casting gold across the field. Gideon carried Hazel's chair across the uneven lawn. "It's beautiful," Hazel whispered. "My father planted it," Gideon said, settling into the wooden chair. "Said every family needs something strong to grow beside." Mara brushed a curl from her face. "Your daughter?" she asked, nodding toward the photo. Gideon didn't flinch. "Layla, she was 8, born with a rare condition. Doctors said she wouldn't live past 3. She gave us 8 amazing years. Taught me more from that chair than I ever learned in school." Hazel looked down and squeezed her hand. "Hazel draws," she said. "Always has. She's quiet, but she sees the world in ways I don't." "I don't feel different," Hazel whispered, then looked at Gideon. "Do you think I'm different?" He met her gaze without blinking. "I think you're brave, and brave never looks the same." Hazel smiled, small and blooming, like the first flower after a long winter. That evening they shared scrambled eggs, toast and sliced apples. Hazel helped set the table. Mara washed dishes, Gideon dried. As he handed her a towel, Mara paused. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't shown up." "I didn't show up," Gideon said, his voice soft. "You did. You just needed someone to hold the door open." Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the apple tree. The old wooden chair rocked gently in the breeze, and in the silence, something began again. He hadn't touched that chair in nearly 2 years. Not since the night Laya left this world as gently as she had entered it, her small frame surrendering in silence. That old wooden chair had once been their shared sanctuary, a sacred space filled with bedtime tales, soft lullabies, harmonica duets, and whispered dreams about what tomorrow might bring. After she passed, Gideon couldn't bring himself to move it. It felt like disturbing it might unravel all that it stood for, so he left it as it was. He watched it from a distance, through storms and sunshine, through falling leaves and spring blossoms, but never close enough to feel the sharp edge of loss, until yesterday. Hazel, with her quiet spirit, had sat beneath the chair, not in it, just beside it, and somehow that changed something in Gideon. It didn't erase the grief, not even close, but it softened it, shifted it, like sunlight bending through the limbs of a tree. That morning, he pulled on his boots and stepped out onto the creaking porch. the wood beneath him both familiar and forgiving. Inside, Mara was already up, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. She wore an oversized flannel shirt over worn jeans, her hair knotted loosely at the back of her head. When Gideon walked in, she looked up, and for a moment, silence passed between them, comfortable and deep. The kind of quiet only 2 people who had survived too many noisy mornings could truly understand. "Coffee?" she asked. He nodded. "Please." They sipped in silence while the soft warmth of the day began to unfold. Hazel was still asleep in the back room, her sketchbook clutched under her arm like a treasured stuffed animal. Mara glanced out the window and broke the silence. "That chair outside? It's beautiful. Looks like it's always been there." Gideon's eyes didn't leave the view. "My dad built it when I was 12. Said no tree was complete without a place to sit and watch it grow." She smiled. "And your daughter loved it." "She lived in it," he said, his voice catching only slightly. "Even when she couldn't go far, we'd wheel her out there, just to let her feel the sun. She'd say it made her feel like she could climb." Mara lowered her gaze, her voice a whisper. "Hazel said something just like that yesterday." Gideon turned toward her then, really looked at her. At the quiet strength in her jaw, the tired lines under her eyes, he saw someone who had walked through fire and hadn't turned to ash. "She's a remarkable kid," he said softly. "She's had to be," Mara replied, a quiet steel in her words. "Her father didn't know how to love her the way she needed. When she lost the ability to walk, he saw only limits. I saw a fighter. He left. We kept going." Gideon wrapped his fingers tighter around his mug. "You didn't just keep going. You survived." Mara didn't answer right away, but her eyes shimmered in the soft morning light. She turned away. Later that morning, Hazel woke and asked if she could go back outside. Gideon carried her carefully across the uneven ground and set her on a quilt beneath the apple tree. Mara followed with crayons and a clean page. Hazel began to draw, tongue peeking from the corner of her lips in deep concentration. Gideon, after a long pause, sat down in the old wooden chair. It creaked beneath his weight, the sound both strange and familiar. His hands rested on the smooth armrests once worn down by Liar's tiny fingers. He had expected pain. Instead, he felt presence. It was as if the chair hadn't been waiting to haunt him, but to welcome him back. Hazel looked up from her drawing. "Is that where she used to sit?" He nodded. "Every day. She must have loved it." "She did." Hazel hesitated, her voice tentative. "Do you think she'd mind if I sat there someday?" Gideon's throat tightened. "I think she'd be honored." Hazel smiled and returned to her drawing. By the afternoon, the air had lightened. Hazel hummed a tune she said she was inventing, the apple tree song. Mara lay beside her, legs stretched out, eyes closed. Gideon emerged from the barn holding a harmonica, the same one Liar had once played. He knelt beside Hazel and offered it. "Want to try?" She blinked. "I don't know how." "I'll teach you." She took it carefully. He sat beside her and guided her hands. Together they blew a wobbly first note, off-key, but full of joy. Mara looked up from her book, a smile tugging at her lips, not polite, not forced, real. And in that moment, it wasn't about what they had lost. It was about what was quietly forming. Something new, something fragile, but something worth believing in. That evening, Gideon took the chair and sanded down a splintered armrest. Then he pulled a second chair from the shed and placed a third pillow on the quilt for Hazel. Mara stepped onto the porch, watching him through the dusk. "You planning a tea party?" she teased. "Maybe," he said, not looking up. "Or maybe I'm just making room." "For what?" He looked at her then, steady and sincere. "For whatever comes next." The next morning arrived with a soft drizzle that tapped against the windows and soaked the earth in silence. Gideon stood at the kitchen sink, coffee in hand, watching the water trickle down the edge of the porch roof. In the distance, Hazel was humming, off-key, joyful. The harmonica's breathy notes followed like shy echoes. He smiled. Since Mara and Hazel had come, something in the house had shifted. It didn't feel hollow anymore. The spaces Liar had once filled weren't haunted. They were shared. Mara's laughter no longer startled him. Hazel's giggles, her musical fumbles, they had become punctuation marks in their days. And the chair beneath the apple tree? It no longer stood alone. Hazel had taken to the harmonica like she was born with it, not with perfection, but with soul. Her melodies weren't copied, they were created. Gideon called them Hazel Originals, and each time he said it, she beamed. That afternoon, when the rain turned to a soft mist, he wheeled her outside. Mara followed with tea and a blanket. Hazel placed the harmonica to her lips and played. The notes were jagged at first, hesitant, like someone learning to speak a new language. But then, something clicked. 4 notes in, 3 out, a pause, 2 short bursts. A rhythm took shape. Gideon leaned back, closed his eyes and listened. To someone else, it may have sounded random, but he heard more. He heard hope. Mara whispered beside him. She plays like someone who knows what it means to fall, and what it takes to rise. He opened his eyes and saw her watching Hazel, a quiet pride in her gaze that only mothers truly understand. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "how they turn out this strong, despite everything?" Mara chuckled. "Every day. Sometimes I think she's teaching me more than I'm teaching her." "I used to think the same about Laya." She turned to him, surprised. "You don't talk much about her." "I don't," he admitted. "Not because I don't want to. I just never met someone who knew how to listen without trying to fix it." "You don't need fixing, Gideon," she said gently. "Just someone who knows how to sit in the silence." They sat that way for a long time. Hazel, oblivious to their words, continued playing. Her next tune slower, softer, and when she finished, she asked, "Did I mess it up?" Gideon shook his head. "You made it yours. That's what music is for." Her eyes lit up. "Can we write one together?" He hesitated. It had been years since he composed anything, but Hazel's hope was contagious. "I'll get my guitar." That evening, under porch lights and Missouri twilight, Gideon brought out an old acoustic guitar, its strings slightly tarnished, its tone still warm. Hazel blew 4 notes, a pause, then another. Gideon mirrored her rhythm, finger-picking gently. Together, they created something fragile and stunning. Mara wiped her eyes. It wasn't sadness, it was something deeper. When they finished, silence settled over them. "That was ours," Hazel whispered. Gideon smiled. "Yes, it was." Later that night, with Hazel asleep, Mara stood on the porch beside him. "I used to think life was a storm," she said, "something you just had to survive, but now it feels more like a song, one you didn't know the melody to, until someone began playing beside you." Gideon looked at her, really looked. "You ever wonder," he asked, "if maybe, just maybe, we meet certain people because our broken parts sing in the same key?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. And beneath the apple tree, the chair no longer waited. It welcomed. The drawing was simple, imperfect even. The lines wobbled, the colours bled slightly outside the edges, and yet, somehow, it spoke volumes. Beneath the wide branches of an old apple tree, 3 figures came to life on the page. A man with a guitar resting against his knee, a woman cradling a basket of apples, and a young girl in a wheelchair holding a harmonica. There were no perfect angles, no polished strokes, but the emotion soared off the paper like music, pure, wordless, real. Gideon stared at it, breath caught halfway in his chest. Beside him, Mara gently placed her hand over her heart, as if to still its sudden flutter. And little Hazel, eyes bright and cheeks flushed, looked up and whispered, "It's us. I wanted to draw the way it feels." Gideon knelt beside her and softly touched the corner of the page, as though afraid to break the spell. "Hazel, you didn't just draw a picture. You captured something I didn't even know how to say." "What's that?" she asked. He looked between her and Mara and smiled. "This, right here. This is home." Hazel's eyes searched his, full of quiet hope. "Can I hang it in the kitchen?" Mara's voice broke gently. "Yes, baby. Of course you can." That afternoon, something nudged Gideon. It wasn't planned. He had just gone into town to pick up nails, some feed, and a quart of white paint for the trim. But as he passed the general store, something stirred inside him. A quiet, persistent pull. Inside, old Mr. Harris manned the counter, his usual wall of flyers and community announcements behind him. Gideon walked over, holding Hazel's drawing like it was made of glass. "Mind if I pin something up?" he asked. "Yours?" Harris raised an eyebrow. "My house," Gideon replied. "But the art? That's from a little girl with a very big heart." Harris grinned. "Sounds like a better story than half the stuff up there." So Gideon pinned it, unsigned, right there on the board, between a lost cat notice and a flyer for the spring fair. He didn't expect much. But 2 days later there was a knock on the farmhouse door. Mara answered it, finding a woman in her 50s holding an envelope, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "I hope this isn't strange," the woman said. "I saw a drawing in town. It looked like my family before we lost my husband. I don't know who drew it, but it made me remember the good. I just wanted to say thank you." Mara invited her in for coffee, and that was just the beginning. A week later, a teenager showed up. Nervous, eyes darting, hands in his pockets. He said the drawing made him call his estranged dad for the first time in years. Then came a couple, then a pastor, then a schoolteacher. One after another they came, hearts touched by something they couldn't quite explain. Hazel didn't get it. "I just drew what I felt," she said. But Gideon understood. He saw it clearly now, a small miracle rooted under the apple tree, quietly growing beyond it. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the orchard, painting the sky with fire-coloured light, Gideon hammered a new board onto the shed wall. He titled it Hazel's Wall. He pinned her original sketch and began adding notes, thank you letters, kind words sent from strangers who'd felt something shift inside them. Mara stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes soft. "You realize you're turning her into a local legend." Gideon just smiled. "I'm giving credit where it's due." "She sees the world differently," Mara whispered. "Not better, not worse, just deeper. She reminds us that we don't have to be perfect to be meaningful." And as they stood there together, man, woman, child, the silence between them filled with something sacred, like the quiet just before a song begins again. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. Gideon almost tossed it aside. Tucked between a seed catalogue and an overdue electric bill, it bore a return address he didn't recognize. But something about the handwriting made him pause. Soft curves, deliberate strokes, warm and thoughtful. He opened it. Mara was in the kitchen peeling apples. Hazel sat at the table sketching another version of the apple tree, this time with musical notes drifting through the branches like butterflies. Gideon cleared his throat and read the letter aloud. "Dear Mr. Blake, my name is Ellen Harwood. I run a non-profit arts organization in St. Louis for children with disabilities. A friend recently shared a drawing they saw in Haven Ridge. A family beneath an apple tree, a girl with a harmonica, and something about it moved us deeply. It was unsigned, but unforgettable. We'd like to formally invite the artist to contribute to our upcoming exhibit, titled Unseen Strength. We believe her voice belongs in the world. With gratitude, Ellen Harwood." Hazel looked up, lips parted, her crayon frozen in midair. They want my picture?" "No," Mara said, tears in her eyes. "They want you, sweetheart," Hazel whispered. "But I'm not famous." Gideon leaned in and said softly, "You're something better. You're true." The weeks that followed were a beautiful kind of chaos. Gideon helped scan Hazel's drawings. The exhibit selected 3, including the original apple tree sketch. A local reporter came by and called Hazel the town's youngest ambassador of kindness. The event would be in late April. St. Louis was 3 hours away, a big trip for them. Mara hadn't travelled that far in years. Hazel had never been that far from home, but somehow she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Gideon fixed up the old truck, rotated the tyres, polished the dashboard until it gleamed. He repaired a case for Hazel's harmonica and gifted her a tin of coloured pencils that once belonged to Lila. "She'd want you to have them," he said. Hazel held them close to her heart. On the day of the trip, the sky was cold and clear. Mara packed sandwiches and a thermos of cider. Hazel wore a blouse with tiny sunflowers on the cuffs. Her sketchbook stayed on her lap the whole ride. The city overwhelmed her at first, so loud, so fast. But when they entered the exhibit hall, something shifted. Silence. The walls were lined with children's art from across the country, paintings, photographs, poetry. And then, there it was. Her drawing. Framed in white wood, printed on canvas. Beneath it, Hazel Lindley, age 8, Haven Ridge, Missouri. A crowd gathered. One woman wiped her eyes. A man in a wheelchair took a picture and whispered to his daughter. Hazel stared at it, unsure if she should cry or smile. Gideon leaned down and asked, "What does it feel like?" She whispered, "Like my heart stood up." At the reception, Ellen Harwood approached, a silver-haired woman with eyes full of kindness. "You have a rare gift," she told Hazel. "You remind people what it means to belong." Then she added, "We'd like to sponsor your art for a year, supplies, mentorship, and if you're willing, we'd love for you to speak at next year's youth conference." "Speak?" Hazel blinked. "Like on a stage?" "Only if you want to," Ellen smiled. "Just tell your story, how you see the world." Hazel looked to her mom, then to Gideon. She nodded. I think I'd like that. That night, in a quiet hotel room just outside the city, Hazel fell asleep with her sketchbook in her arms. Mara stood at the window, watching the lights flicker below. Gideon came up beside her with 2 mugs. You proud? He asked. I'm in awe, she replied. They clinked mugs. All those nights I wondered if there was a place for us in this world. There was, Gideon said softly. It just took a little time to show itself. You've given her so much. He smiled. I gave her a porch and an apple tree. The rest? That's all her. He paused. But I think she's given me more. Mara reached for his hand, their fingers laced together quietly. They didn't need to say it. This wasn't an ending. This was the beginning of everything. And weeks later, in a massive auditorium full of strangers, Hazel sat backstage, her harmonica in one hand, the tin of coloured pencils in the other, one to help her breathe, the other to remind her that even the smallest things can bring colour to the world. When her name was called, the crowd hushed like the tide pulling back. Gideon wheeled her forward and bent low. You've already done the hard part, he whispered. Now, let them feel it. And then he stepped back, leaving her in the light, where she belonged. She lifted the harmonica gently, hands trembling ever so slightly. When she brought it to her lips, the first note floated into the air like a whisper on wind, delicate, wavering, as if testing its own courage. Then came another note, this one steadier, fuller, until a melody emerged. It was the same simple, brave tune she had pieced together with Gideon back home. Each note carried the weight of memory, of healing, of hope. When the last note faded, the room didn't erupt in applause right away. No, it sat in stillness, a deep, reverent quiet that only happens when people have felt something honest, something unexpected. And then, slowly, hands began to clap, one by one, rising like the sun. Applause spread through the room like warmth cutting through a long winter. Hazel smiled through it all, her cheeks flushed with something more than pride, something like belonging. She waved. Backstage, Mara wept silently into her palms, and Gideon, he closed his eyes, letting the sound wrap around him like a soft blanket of forgiveness. Afterward, the people came in waves. Some asked for autographs, others handed her folded notes or leaned in close just to whisper, "Thank you." One girl, around Hazel's age, knelt down, held her hand tight, and said, "You made me feel brave." That night, in the quiet of a hotel room, Hazel lay curled beneath a patchwork quilt, staring up at the ceiling. "Mom?" she asked softly. "Yes, baby? Do you think I was enough?" Mara turned from the window, her silhouette framed in moonlight. She crossed the room, knelt beside her daughter, and smiled through the ache in her chest. "You weren't just enough," she whispered. "You were light." Hazel turned to Gideon, who sat quietly in the corner, holding the old tin pencil box she loved so much. "And you?" she asked. "Did I do okay?" Gideon rose, slow and gentle, and sat beside her bed. His voice was steady, but his eyes shimmered. "You didn't just do okay, Hazel. You reached into people's hearts the way most grown-ups spend their whole lives trying to. You reminded them what it feels like to be truly seen." Hazel nodded thoughtfully, her eyelids heavy with sleep. "I liked it. All of it. But I think I like our tree more." Gideon smiled. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Back in Haven Ridge, spring had come early. The old apple tree stood tall and still, its buds just beginning to bloom, soft pink petals curled like secrets waiting to unfold. On the porch, Mara sat quietly with a mug of tea cradled in her hands, watching Gideon repair the wooden swing he'd promised Hazel he'd finish before her next drawing day. His hands worked slowly, carefully, every knot and nail a quiet prayer for something steady. When he finished, he stood back, hands on hips, and looked out at the tree. "She's still got time," he said. "Plenty more songs in her." "And you?" Mara asked. "You still got songs left in you too?" He hesitated, just for a breath. "I think I'm finally learning how to sing again." She walked to him then, placed her hand gently over his, and together they looked out at the tree, once a monument of grief, now blooming with something new. It happened quietly, so quietly that Gideon almost didn't notice at all. The sun had barely risen when he realized the breakfast table was still set from the night before. Hazel's harmonica, always on the windowsill, was gone. Her sketchbook, usually left near the fruit bowl, missing. He checked the guest room. The bed was made too perfectly. No note on the fridge, no packed bags, just silence. A silence that felt like the house itself was holding its breath. He stepped outside. Dew glistened on the grass. The apple tree swayed gently in the breeze, the swing creaking softly, but empty. Hazel didn't call for him that morning, and Mara, she was gone too. He walked the property, at first in denial, half believing he might find them picking wildflowers or sketching in the orchard. But the truth came slow, like fog settling into a valley. They'd left. No goodbye, no warning. Just gone. Back inside, he stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen. Something sharp twisted inside him, not quite grief, not yet anger, just emptiness. Then, beneath Hazel's favourite coaster, he found it, a note. His name written in her careful block letters with tiny hearts for the dots. He unfolded it with hands that suddenly felt too old. Dear Mr. Gideon, I'm sorry we didn't say goodbye. Mama says goodbyes feel like endings, but I don't think this is the end. She said we might have stayed too long, but to me it didn't feel like staying. It felt like home. You helped me hear music in the wind. You made me feel like I wasn't just a girl in a chair. You made me feel like family. So this isn't goodbye. It's just, we'll see you again soon. Love, Hazel. P.S. I left you a surprise under the apple tree. Gideon shot up, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. He bolted across the yard, heart-pounding. And there, beneath the apple tree, was a cardboard tube, tied with a strip of gingham fabric. He dropped to his knees and opened it. Inside was a drawing, the porch, the apple tree, 3 chairs beneath it. One was empty. One held a girl with a sketch pad. The last, a man playing guitar. But there was something new, a 4th figure walking toward them. A woman, soft-featured, glowing with light in her eyes. And at the bottom of the page, in tiny handwriting, you don't have to wait for family to come to you. Gideon clutched the drawing to his chest. His throat ached. His heart cracked open in quiet surrender. He thought of Lyra, of the chair he hadn't touched in 2 years. He thought of Mara, who had entered his life like sunrise, and of Hazel, who hadn't just seen the pain, but the possibility. She hadn't said goodbye because she believed this wasn't the end. And maybe she was right. 2 days passed. Gideon fed the chickens, split wood, sat on the porch and stared at the swing. But something inside him had changed. He didn't just miss them. He wanted them back. Not as guests, not as a miracle passing through, as his. He found an old sticky note with Mara's handwriting on it, directions from the day he'd helped fix Hazel's wheelchair. He called. No answer. So he packed a bag. He put the drawing in the front seat, wore the old wool jacket Ly had picked for him once, and he drove. Past wheat fields. Bus stations. Rivers, each mile humming with something new. Hope. He found them near Springfield, a modest house. Mara stood on the porch, watering can in hand. She froze. Hazel looked up and squealed, "Gideon!" He walked slowly, no grand speech, no theatrics, just steady steps of a man walking towards something real. "What are you doing here?" Mara whispered. He smiled, pulling out the drawing tube. "I got your message, the one that said, not to wait anymore." She blinked. "I didn't know if we'd ever hear from you." "I didn't either," he admitted. "But then I realized something." "What's that?" He looked from her to Hazel, who was already smiling like sunrise. "I don't want to go back to a house that used to feel like home. I want to build one, with you." Mara laughed through tears. "You always talk like that. Only when I'm terrified." She took his hand. "Good, because I'm scared too." Hazel clapped. "Does this mean we're going back to the tree?" Gideon knelt down and grinned. "If you're still willing to teach me what it means to belong, yes." Hazel nodded solemnly. "Deal." That night, they drove home, together. Back to the porch, back to the apple tree, back to the chair that no longer waited, but welcomed. The road stretched long and golden beneath the fading sky. Mara sat in the passenger seat, her hand resting gently on Hazel's knee. In the back, Hazel watched the world blur into soft colours. No one spoke. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full, like a song just before its chorus. And when they pulled into the driveway, the porch light glowed, the wind chimes swayed, and the apple tree stood exactly as they had left it, quiet, strong, and waiting. Hazel looked up at it, eyes bright. "Did you miss us?" she whispered to the tree. Its branches rustled gently. "I think that's a yes," Gideon said, smiling. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just home. He felt it. One quiet evening, after Hazel had fallen asleep, Gideon and Mara sat on the porch together. Fireflies blinked across the open field like tiny lanterns floating in the summer dusk. "I've been thinking," Gideon said, gently swirling the tea in his cup, about what Hazel said, about staying. Mara turned to him, uncertain. "And?" He looked into her eyes. "I think it's time we built something permanent." She raised an eyebrow, half teasing. "Like a shed?" He smiled softly. "No, I mean a life, a home, together." Her breath hitched. She looked away for a moment, then back at him. "Are you sure? You've carried so much loss, Gideon." "I've carried it alone," he said quietly, "but I don't want to do that anymore." Without another word, she reached for his hand. "I don't know what forever looks like," she whispered, "but I know what it feels like. And it feels like this." They sat there in stillness, hand in hand, the silhouette of the old apple tree etched against a sky full of stars. No hurry, no fear, just being, fully present in a moment that felt like it had been waiting for them all along. The next morning, Hazel wheeled herself into the kitchen with a fresh drawing in her lap. She slid it across the table to Gideon. It was the apple tree again, but beneath its branches stood 4 figures, a man, a woman, a girl in a wheelchair, and a small baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Gideon's eyes widened. "What's this?" Hazel beamed. "It's the future." Mara's cheeks flushed pink. "We were going to tell you," she said, her voice soft. "I found out last week. I just didn't know how." Gideon stood slowly, walked over and placed both hands gently on her shoulders. "You just did." Then he leaned down and kissed her forehead. Tender, reverent, like he was sealing a promise not just to Mara, but to the life they were creating together. Outside, the wind passed through the apple tree like a whispered hymn. And beneath it, the empty chairs didn't feel like they were waiting for people anymore. They were waiting for stories to begin. Spring didn't explode into Haven Ridge that year. It crept in softly, on the wings of robins, in the smell of damp earth, in the way the sunlight lingered just a little longer each evening. One morning, it was simply there, like someone had quietly turned a page overnight. Gideon noticed it first. Standing by the bedroom window, coffee in hand, he blinked hard, thinking maybe his tired eyes were fooling him. But no, he wasn't mistaken. The apple tree had bloomed. It hadn't in 2 years, not since Lyra passed. For 2 long springs, the branches had stayed bare, green but silent, as if the tree itself was in mourning. He had stopped hoping for blossoms, but there they were, blushing pink, delicate white, catching the early sun like soft flames, a quiet miracle. He called out instinctively, "Hazel! Come quick!" She came wheeling down the hall, Mara trailing behind, robe half-tied. "Is everything okay?" Gideon pointed. Hazel gasped. "It's happening." And together they just stood there, 3 souls in awe, watching something sacred unfold. Later that morning, Gideon gently carried Hazel to the swing under the tree. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms, sweet and familiar, like a memory returning home. Mara spread out a blanket in the grass, her hand resting absent-mindedly on the small curve of her belly. She wasn't far along, but Gideon had already started carving a second crib. Hazel looked up at the blooming branches. "It waited," she said. Gideon sat beside her. "Waited for what?" "For us," she replied, "to come back." He looked at her then, this brave little girl who still believed in beauty even when it was buried deep. "You might be right," he whispered. Hazel leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think the baby will love it here? With you as a big sister?" He smiled. "That baby won't know how not to love it here." That afternoon the garden came alive. Gideon turned the soil. Mara planted lavender along the fence line. And Hazel, clipboard in hand, directed the day like a tiny general, drawing layouts, assigning planting zones. They laughed more than they worked. Mara tossed dirt onto Gideon's boot. Hazel tried to whistle but blew dandelion fuzz straight into her own hair. It was the kind of day that didn't ask for anything loud or grand. It simply asked you to be there. That evening, after Hazel had gone to bed, Gideon and Mara sat on the porch again, watching the sky bleed into the earth. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Is it okay that we're happy, after everything?" He exhaled slowly. "Happiness isn't the absence of pain. It's what you build with the pieces." She nodded, quiet. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong." "Something probably will," he said honestly. "But when it does, we'll face it together." A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness, but from release. "I never thought I'd have this again," she whispered. "You never lost it. he replied. You were just walking toward it. She kissed him, soft and grateful. Thank you for waiting. I didn't, he smiled. You just came while the porch light was still on. A few nights later, Hazel surprised them at dinner. I want to throw a party, she announced. Gideon raised an eyebrow. A party? A thank you party, she clarified. For the tree, it bloomed again. It deserves a celebration. And so, that Saturday, Haven Ridge hosted its first Apple Tree Thank You Festival. Neighbours came carrying mason jars of cider and homemade pies. Children ran laughing through the orchard, tying ribbons to the branches. Someone brought a banjo, another a tambourine. Gideon played guitar, Hazel harmonica. Their melody danced with the breeze through the blossoms. Mara wore a soft blue dress, spinning barefoot in the grass. Hazel wheeled herself in wide circles, pretending to dance. And on the shed wall, taped with care, were over 40 drawings, sunsets, bicycles, family portraits. But one stood out, a simple crayon sketch of a wooden chair beneath the apple tree. Empty, waiting, and next to it in a child's handwriting, "Thank you for waiting for us." That night after the guests had gone, Gideon sat under the tree again. The swing swayed gently, empty. The wind was soft, the earth was warm. Mara curled up beside him, resting her head on his chest. He placed a hand on her belly. "You feel that?" She nodded. "It's kicking." From the porch, Hazel's sleepy voice called out, "Did the tree like the party?" Gideon looked up into the branches, heavy with blossoms. "I think it did," he said. "No, I think it finally feels full again." As autumn tiptoed into Haven Ridge, it came not with storms, but softness. Apple-scented breezes, golden light, the rustle of leaves beneath Hazel's wheels as she zipped through the orchard paths in a new chair Gideon had built just for her. And the tree, now full with red fruit, stood at the heart of it all, like a sentinel of second chances. On the porch, chairs had multiplied. Liar's old seat, which Hazel now called the Queen's Throne, Mara's wicker rocker, draped with a quilt of their earliest memories, and beside them, a brand-new cradle-shaped chair for their newborn son. They named him Jonah Blake, after Gideon's grandfather, who once said, "Nothing planted in love ever fails to grow, even if it takes time." Hazel insisted on a welcome ceremony. She hand-drew invitations with tiny apples, decorated the porch with paper lanterns, and played a 3-note harmonica fanfare she'd composed herself. Gideon held Jonah in one arm and tried reading her speech aloud, but his voice cracked halfway through. So Mara stepped in, holding Hazel's hand. Right there on the porch, where grief had once sat like a shadow, hope finally settled in. The days that followed passed like honey, slow, golden, sacred. Gideon woke before dawn, not from grief but from love, humming lullabies to Jonah as the stars faded behind the hills. Mara baked cinnamon bread. Hazel turned the living room corner into her big sister art studio, where she sketched their growing family in colours brighter than ever. But underneath the joy was a quiet reverence for everything that had been lost and everything found again. One crisp October evening, Gideon found Hazel beneath the apple tree, sketchbook in hand. "What are you working on?" he asked, settling beside her. She showed him, a drawing of Liar's chair, surrounded by falling petals. "I think she's still here," Hazel whispered. "Every time the wind moves the swing, every time we play music, I think she likes that we're all here now." Gideon looked at her, eyes full. "She would have adored you," he said. Hazel tilted her head. "Do you think Jonah will remember her?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He'll feel her," he said, "just like you do." They sat together in silence, beneath a tree that had once mourned with them and now bloomed with them. A tree that waited, a porch that stayed lit, a family rebuilt, and the quiet miracle of being whole again.